So it's that eternal issue that we have seen in the past. So from that perspective, an increasing deficit and an upward trend in spending, it's concerning because in the past, what we've seen is this year's deficit is higher or expenditures are higher this year, but we promise that we'll control spending starting next year. Next year happen, and it doesn't. It's not seen in the numbers. It's still higher spending, generally speaking, but we'll have to wait and see what is in the budget.
Hello, welcome to Inside Policy Talks, the podcast of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. I'm Ian Campbell, digital editor here at MLI. It has been more than 10 months since Canadians last got a close look at the federal finances. In last fall's economic update, they learned that the deficit for the 2023-24 fiscal year had ballooned by more than 50%. Now, with the Carney government set to table its first fiscal blueprint, there's once again talk of rising spending and soaring deficits, with a recent Desjardins forecast suggesting that the deficit for the current fiscal year could exceed $70 billion. That's 65% higher than what was forecast in FES 2024. So, what should Canadians be watching for when the numbers come down next week? And more importantly, with billions of dollars set to flow from federal coffers, are parliamentarians well positioned to provide the scrutiny to that spending on behalf of Canadians that they're meant to provide under our Westminster system? To set this up, we're joined by Yves Giroux, former parliamentary budget officer who finished his term just last month. Before we begin, please remember to like and subscribe. It really helps us reach more people with these conversations. Yves Giroux, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for the invitation, Ian.
Well, it's great to see you here in your post-PBO role. And when Finance Minister François-Philippe Champagne delivers his first budget next week, it's going to be nearly a year since the last FES, more than a year and a half since the last budget. What should Canadians be watching for when this budget comes down?
Well, one thing that virtually everybody who has followed federal politics and public finances in the last several years will be watching for is certainly the level of the deficit and the trajectory of the debt, whether the deficit or debt to GDP ratio rather keeps increasing or whether it takes a decreasing trend. So that's something that I will be very closely watching for. And the components of that increased, well, everybody believes it will be an increased deficit. So what will be the main reasons behind the increasing deficit? Will it be social spending? Will it be defense spending? Or will it be support for trade exposed and affected sectors, or transformational investments, to use the words that government ministers have used pretty profusely over the last couple of weeks. So that's one of the many elements that I'll be watching for, and I'm sure Canadians will be very curious to see what the headline number for the deficit in the current and next couple of years will be.
Absolutely. And you mentioned that language around generational investments. Mark Carney talked about swinging for the fences with these generational investments. And yet he also talked about making sacrifices. So when we kind of parse out that language that might seem a bit contradictory, what kind of budget do you see that setting up, and how can the government sort of navigate those tensions?
That's a very interesting point, because we've seen or we've heard messages that could seem to be contradictory. As you said, aiming for the fences or hitting for the fences, whatever the expression is, and sacrifices at the same time, while everybody expects a much higher deficit. So that suggests a significant increase in spending or tax cuts, you never know. But at the same time, the Prime Minister and his ministers have been signaling that there will be austerity in this budget. So what I think that means is that sectors that have seen increases in the last several years, notably the public sector, are better. They should brace for reductions and cuts and savings and maybe reorganizations, as the Minister of Finance has clearly asked his colleagues to send him requests for reductions in expenditures of 5% starting in April 26, 7.5% the following year, and 15% starting in April 2028. So that's significant savings and expenditure reductions in what has been called operating expenditures. And just to recap, operating expenditures have been defined as personnel costs for the public service, consultants' fees, rents, travel expenditures, but also grants and contributions to businesses, not-for-profits, and so on. So the main items that have been excluded from that savings exercises are old age security, EI, and the major transfers to provinces, with D&D and public safety subjected to 2% reductions only. So everybody else has to provide scenarios for reductions of 5, 7.5, and 15% in the third year. And that will be very difficult to achieve, considering that the government itself has established or set some constraints for itself, notably that personnel reductions would be done through attrition. So if that's indeed the case, and there are areas where you don't want to have attrition, for example, food inspectors, you don't necessarily want to have attrition in this big sector that's very important, or drugs approval for at Health Canada. So there are sectors where it would be very delicate to let attrition reduce the workforce. So if you factor this in, as well as presumably a growing Department of National Defense department, CBSA being hard to really cut when you are a trade-dependent nation like Canada. So that leaves very little, well, it reduces the scope for public sector reductions if you really mean attrition. So all that to say, it's a long way of saying that if the government really is serious about reducing the size of the public service just by attrition, it will have to hit grants and contributions if it does indeed reduce its operating spending by up to 15%.
Now, so given some of those tensions that you're mentioning there, combined with the fact that we've seen a pattern in recent years of the government missing its deficit target. So of course, for the 23-24 fiscal year, the projected deficit of 40 billion suddenly ballooned to 61.9 billion. Now, the government at the time said that was the result of some large one-time contingent liabilities. However, as your PBO reported at the time, there were likely some other factors at play there as well. Given this track record and some of the challenges you're identifying, how concerning is it that we might see some more very large deficits get posted?
One trend that has been clear over the last several years is that every time the government tables a budget or a fall economic statement, the future track of expenditures goes up. So, and if you take a snapshot, what was the anticipated expenditures? Were the expenditures expected for, say, 26, 27? You look at past budgets, and every successive document anticipated higher and higher spending for that very same year. So we have been in a situation where every single budget document or fall update increases the overall level of spending for any given year in the future. And same with the deficit, generally speaking. So even though governments have suggested or indicated that the deficit will decrease over time, or will be no more than 1% of GDP by a certain year, or that the debt to GDP ratio will continue to decline, what we have seen in the past, up to now at least, is that the debt to GDP ratio is rather stabilizing, barely decreasing, at times decreasing, but overall there's no clear downward trend. Expenditures go up, and that's the same thing that we've seen with the overall number of public servants. So every time you look at the departmental plans that are tabled usually in the spring, you see that departments are saying next year our headcount will go down. But next year arrives and it's the opposite that happens. But they still say, but next year our headcount will go down. So it's like somebody promising to go on a diet, but next week comes and it's still the same answer. I'll go on a diet next week. So it's that eternal issue that we have seen in the past. So from that perspective, an increasing deficit and an upward trend in spending, it's concerning because in the past, what we've seen is this year's deficit is higher or expenditures are higher this year, but we promise that we'll control spending starting next year. Next year happened, and it doesn't. It's not seen in the numbers. It's still higher spending, generally speaking. But this year could be different with the government having signaled its intention to reduce operating spending and anecdotal evidence suggesting that some departments have already started reducing the size of their workforce. So this year could be different, but we'll have to wait and see what is in the budget. One thing that I'll be carefully watching for is the debt to GDP ratio, whether it goes up, and if so, over how many years and how long before the government expects it to start to decrease again.
Mm-hmm. And that was one thing the recent Desjardins forecast looked at as well, and it predicts that will rise. The recent PBO report released after you left the office predicts that will rise.
Mm-hmm.
So if that happens, this would join sort of a long list of fiscal anchors that the Liberal government over its 10 years in office has dropped. How concerning is it that they miss targets that they set, dropping fiscal anchors? Former Finance Canada official Eugene Lang has a great article where he tracks all the different fiscal anchors that have been dropped over the last 10 years. What's your thoughts on the potential impact of the government potentially losing another one of its fiscal anchors?
Well, fiscal anchors are used for two main reasons. So to demonstrate fiscal responsibility to the public, financial markets, ratings agencies, but also to guide decision making. So when you have a fiscal anchor, it's very helpful in determining which areas to focus scarce resources to, either tax cuts or additional spending. When you lose fiscal anchors or when you change your fiscal anchors, it makes it less easy to understand what's guiding the government in its decision, its trade-off decisions as to where to allocate its resources. It also erodes the confidence of financial markets in the seriousness or the control that a government has over its own finances. It's understandable to change your fiscal anchor if the situation changes significantly. Nobody expected governments to stick to their pre-COVID fiscal anchors when the pandemic hit. But when you have a series of fiscal anchors that you change almost on an annual basis, it starts to erode the confidence that one neutral observer can have in the control that a government has on its own finances. And in Canada, as you mentioned, we have seen a couple of different fiscal anchors being adopted over time, from debt servicing costs that were very low, and the government was proud of that and focusing on that, to a declining debt to GDP ratio until that stopped declining. Then we also moved to a deficit that will be no higher than 1% of GDP by 26-27. That has not been reiterated in a while. And now the most recent fiscal anchor that we've heard would be what is to have the operating budget in balance in a few years. But operating balance or operating budget being defined under a new set of guidelines that would send more spending in the investment bucket. And again, investment being loosely defined and defined differently than the accounting principles that are accepted by authorities in Canada, notably the AG, and also internationally recognized definitions of investment. So it's a lot of uncertainty as we are getting ready to see the budget. And just to go back on the Desjardins study that you mentioned with respect to the deficit, there was also a very interesting piece published by Scotiabank on Wednesday that paints a very good pre-budget picture related to the challenges, and it also pegs the deficit for the current year at well above $80 billion. So there's a couple of different independent and very credible institutions that are signaling that the deficit could be between 75 and $100 billion at the federal level. And I think when you have that many people signaling that, it's a clear indication that we're heading that way.
And, in terms of the fiscal anchors, a number of observers have said to me that they see it as it's not even so important which fiscal anchor you choose, but just that you have one and that you stick to it. I'm wondering, do you share that view? And if so, what does the government need to do if it's going to stick to a fiscal anchor?
Well, the government should think very carefully before choosing a fiscal anchor with the expectation that it will stick to that fiscal anchor for the foreseeable future, meaning several years. So that's why choosing one fiscal anchor is important. The choice is important because you're expected to use it for the foreseeable future. Of course, if you choose the wrong fiscal anchor and there's wide agreement that you picked the wrong horse, then you can change. But that's why changing your fiscal anchor can have consequences when it comes to the fiscal credibility of a government. So I agree that one fiscal anchor should be chosen wisely, and the government should stick to it. And yeah, you're right. It doesn't have to be, there's no one magical fiscal anchor. Although a declining or stable debt to GDP ratio is a very useful one because it provides sufficient marge de maneuver for governments to react to unforeseen events. But other governments have chosen to have a size of the deficit that doesn't exceed a certain threshold. Debt servicing cost, I think debt servicing cost is one fiscal anchor, but then it's more like a secondary effect than a clear consequence of fiscal choices because the debt servicing costs are influenced obviously by the size of the debt, but also by interest rates. So a government that sticks or puts too much weight on that fiscal anchor is at risk of being held hostage to rising interest rates, or can feel that they have much more fiscal flexibility than they really do if interest rates go down for various reasons. So, but it's a fiscal anchor, and if a government chooses to hang its hat on this one, so be it. But I think the main point is to stick to one fiscal anchor that is relatively achievable and credible, but also relatively easy to understand. And that's why something like debt servicing costs starts to be a bit less easy to understand by laypersons, even by some people who are financially savvy.
And certainly that's the point that I know Trevor Thomas made as well, the easy to understand component, because that makes it work better from an accountability point of view, that there's just more of the public that is going to understand what the government's committing to, and it hopefully might then cause them to have to stick to it a little bit better.
Yeah, and it's important for something to be easy to understand because public finances are often compared with household finances. And it's not the same thing because as an individual or a household, we sadly have a finite time horizon. Eventually, we will die and we will stop working and we'll have to draw down on our savings to live in retirement or in illness, for example, whereas a government does not have a finite time horizon. Eventually, government cease to exist, but it's very hard to predict when that happens and which form it takes. So we don't have the same time horizons individuals in government. So right there are often misconceptions about why can governments run deficits year after year after year? I could never do that as an individual. No, because you don't want to leave debts behind to your kids or the lucky ones you'll inherit after you. But a government does not have the same constraint.
At the end of the day, Sean Speer had an article in the Hub last week where he suggested that one of Justin Trudeau's most significant legacies, for better or for worse, may be that he broke the 1990s, early 2000s consensus around balanced budgets and has returned us to a consensus around deficit spending. Now, given that one of the Trudeau government's legacies is not only the return to deficits, but also a large overall rise in program spending during the Trudeau era, particularly on programs that used the federal spending power to move into areas of social policy, traditionally seen as more so being the domain of the provinces. How feasible is any return to balanced budgets without revisiting the extent of Ottawa's involvement in some of these programs?
That's a very good question. And anybody who has ever received a regular check from the government will know the feeling pretty well that you quickly get accustomed to receiving that check. And when your situation changes, for example, you earn a higher salary, you stop receiving some of these checks because they're income tested. There's always a little feeling of loss, even if overall you're much better off because you earn higher wages or salaries. But the feeling of loss is something that is deep and hard to combat in individuals. So if the government was to reduce its deficit or spending levels through canceling or clawing back some or reducing some of these social benefits that have been announced and implemented over time, it could risk difficult decisions. Sorry, because people get accustomed and they see that as their right to continue to receive these benefits. A couple of examples: lower daycare spots, $10 a day, not yet implemented nationally, but um, costs have gone down in many regions. Dental care is also something that people are getting accustomed to, and the public sector jobs. It's very hard to say to somebody, "You're a very nice person, but we have to let you go starting in a few weeks, few months, because there's cutback. Nothing against you, but you're losing your job." It's very difficult to have these conversations. So that's why I think reducing the level of the deficit will be difficult if it's done through reductions in these social programs that have been gradually implemented over the last several years. But it's possible. Canada has done it in the 1990s. It's possible to do it, but these are not easy conversations and certainly not easy decisions. Same thing with cutting subsidies and grants and contributions to certain groups. It's it's the squeaky wheel that gets oiled, as we often say. And these can be very squeaky wheels because if you're not for profit and you've been relying on a $1 million a year subsidy to operate from the feds, and getting this cut by half or eliminated entirely makes your job much more difficult.
So shifting to the bigger picture then, as all of this big ticket spending continues to flow, our parliamentarians are meant to be the ones who are there to scrutinize this. But something that you and I have talked about a number of times before is that there are several long-standing issues with Canada's current process around budgets, estimates, accounts, the fiscal cycle broadly, that makes it difficult for MPs and senators to exercise very much scrutiny over how taxpayers' money is spent.
Mhm.
Now, the Carney government has proposed some changes to the process, and we'll chat about how some of those may or may not affect some of these long-standing issues. But first, just for folks who might not be aware of some of these, can you lay out what some of the big picture issues are related to timing and the opacity of some of the documents that have made it difficult for parliamentarians to exercise a high degree of scrutiny?
Sure. So before we get into the why it was traditionally difficult for parliamentarians to scrutinize government spending, I think we need to distinguish between two broad vehicles. First is the budget. So the budget is mostly a plan. So it's a policy document, it's a communications tool through which the government indicates to parliamentarians and the population what its priorities are. So even though there's a vote on the budget, it's a confidence matter in the House. There's no, like, with a few exceptions, it's not a binding document. So people vote on the overall trend and the overall aim of the budget. But the government finances itself, its operations rather, through the main estimates and the supplementary estimates. And these bills are bills, and they include the details of spending for each government department and agency. So CRA will get that many billions to collect taxes and that many hundreds of millions to provide benefits to Canadians, to administer the benefits. Same with virtually every single department and agency in town. So up until now, the government would table its budget February, March, but more recently April, and it would contain a host of new policies and programs. But by legislation, the government has to table its main estimates. So the bill that will finance the operations, keep the lights on, for example, pay public servants' salaries, it had to table, still has to table that by March. So you end up in a situation where parliamentarians are scrutinizing main estimates, but main estimates don't include stuff that is in the budget because it was just recently tabled or will soon be tabled. So you have parliamentarians being asked to approve, let's say, $475 billion of new spending rather. And then they say, but what about the program for snowmobiles that the minister announced in the budget? Which line it's in? And officials say it's not in there because it'll be in the in the subs later on. So it's very confusing for ministers too, but parliamentarians because they see numbers in the main estimates that are not what's in the budget. So very confusing for parliamentarians to scrutinize and make sense of these two distinct documents, the mains and the subs later on, and then the budget.
Of course, and I think it's useful to highlight too that a former NDP MP, Pat Martin, who really championed this issue for a time, he famously described the estimates as arriving in a document the size of a Manhattan phone book. So
Mhm.
these are huge, dense documents, and sometimes they get maybe 1 or 2 hours at committee to be studied, and that's about it. Is that right?
Yeah, because well, sometimes most of the time they get a little bit more time than that because they get sent to different committees. But it's true that individual MPs and senators are not very well equipped to deal with that volume of information. It takes an army of public servants to put these together and to make sense of all that. So to expect parliamentarians to be able to scrutinize main estimates and find out what is spending that makes sense from what is a little bit less justified or even frivolous in their opinion is very, very difficult. So, and they have some support from the Library of Parliament, notably, and the PBO, but these institutions have other things to do than just the main and the supplementary estimates. And there's not that many people in these two institutions to really take a deep, deep dive at the level that parliamentarians sometimes would like to do.
And one other piece that I think never gets the attention it deserves, since it's the very end of the fiscal cycle where we get to see how everything came together and how it all stacked up to what the government initially said it was going to do in its budget, is of course the public accounts. Now those come almost a year and a half or a little more usually after a spring budget would be tabled in traditionally would be tabled in spring 2024, say, and you would get the public accounts, of course, towards the end of 2025. So your PBO also raised some of the concerns around public accounts coming out very late in the year, coming out sometimes after the second set of supplementary estimates or the fall economic statement. What's sort of the impact of the late release of the public accounts and how it, in its role in being sort of that final piece to measure up to what was promised?
Yeah, that's a big gap in accountability and transparency. Just to recap for those who may not be very familiar with the cycle, we have fiscal years that end on March 31st. So you'd expect the departments to be able to come up with the final numbers as to how much they spent compared to how much they were allocated. You'd expect them to come up with these final numbers within a few weeks of the end of the fiscal year, but it takes them a bit more than that. Understandably, government operations can be very complex. There's operations across the country and abroad as well. So it takes them a couple of months to tally the final numbers. And usually the AG has the capacity to sign off on the public accounts. So that means what the government did spend, where it spent it, and on what it spent it in September. So you'd think that in September we'd get the public accounts. So the year that ended on March 31st, that's how much we spend, how much we collected in revenues. Hence, this is the deficit for that year. But the public accounts rarely get tabled in September. So we've seen October, November, and even December. So it means that for the year that ended March, for example, to take an example, March 31st, 2024, parliamentarians had the final number only in December, but that was for the year that was ended in the spring. But in the meantime, the same government was asking them to approve hundreds of billions of dollars in new spending through the main estimates and then the supplementary estimates for measures that were included in a budget or announcements that were made. So by the time MPs and senators had a clear picture of where the money for the previous year went, they had already approved well over 90% of the current year's fiscal or public monies. So they can't really credibly be expected to hold the government to account if they're approving this year's money, virtually all of it, and they don't know yet how the government fared in the previous year. They don't know if it was a gigantic deficit or a much smaller deficit, if revenues were better than expected or lower than expected. They don't have that information. And I think that's a big gap in transparency and accountability because international institutions like the OECD and the IMF, they recommend that public accounts should be tabled no later than 6 months after the end of the fiscal year. And some provinces are able to do that. If they're smaller, you'll say, yeah, Alberta is smaller than the federal government, but they also have fewer people working there. So the government of Canada, with its receiver general, comptroller general, with CFOs in every single department and government institution, they should be able to pull their numbers faster and have the AG in a position to sign off on the public accounts maybe a couple of weeks sooner. But more importantly, there's no reason why the government should sit on the public accounts for months. For example, from September, mid September, say, until December. It's purely for communications reason to avoid delivering these numbers at a time that may be inconvenient for the government.
So, with some of these challenges in mind, let's talk a bit about some of the changes the Carney government is proposing and how these might help or not help with this, and then talk about what else could be done to improve this as well. So, one of the major changes that the Carney government plans to implement is we're having a fall budget this year, and they say they're going to make that a fixture going forward. That's going to be the new time for the budget. What's your thoughts on this? And how that might affect some of those timing issues throughout the fiscal cycle.
So it's fully in line with what I had been recommending throughout my tenure as PBO. In fact, I never dare going that bluntly in an early budget. My recommendation when I was PBO was to have a January or February budget, which would allow for budget measures to be included in the main estimates so that parliamentarians, when reviewing and approving the main estimates, would find the budget measures. So, in my mind, going for a February budget was really ambitious. Maybe a January budget in my dreams, but I pegged that at a 5% chance of ever happening. And then I see a fall budget. It's like beyond my wildest dreams. So I think it's going to make the job of parliamentarians in holding the government to account, scrutinizing government planned expenditures that much easier for them to have a budget in November, for example, and the main estimates tabled probably sometime in February, giving them time to make the reconciliation whenever it's possible that much easier for parliamentarians, but also for those who support them, the Library of Parliament, the PBO, officials in government departments who have to explain and appear at committee, have to explain to parliamentarians what they plan on doing with the money if Parliament agrees to grant their departments with these additional funds. So I think it will make the job of most of these stakeholders much easier, well, much easier, certainly easier, if people behave as expected and the budget measures are indeed included in the main estimates.
Are there any challenges if the budget comes this many months in advance of the mains? Does that set up any challenges, even say world events change and there's a different set of fiscal assumptions underpinning things by the time the mains roll out? What are the challenges there? And if so, how do we navigate those?
Of course, so the later you wait for any document to be tabled, the more information you can incorporate in it. But a March budget or an April budget, when you have a US president that changes his mind and makes threat on Truth Social on a daily basis at various stakeholders, I think it diminishes the argument or the point in favor of a late budget because there will be uncertainty. That's a certainty that there will be unforeseen events. You just don't know, obviously, which events and when and how they will affect the fiscal forecast and the economy. So, might as well control what you can, get your ducks in a row, and get a budget tabled in November, October, whatever the government decides next year. And then you deal with unforeseen events as they materialize, if they do. And one way to be equipped to face these events is to have a cushion, for example, a contingency reserve or some flexibility in your fiscal forecast. But I think it's much better to have a plan laid out early. It allows for better planning on the part of departments and also parliamentarians.
And if a fall budget does end up sticking around as the new standard, what do you think would be the ideal point in the fiscal cycle then for the public accounts to come? Let's say for fiscal year 25-26, if we have a fall 2025 budget, where would you want to see the public accounts ideally come out in that time cycle?
The ideal point in the cycle for the public accounts would be as soon as the AG, the Auditor General, has signed off on them. So if it's middle of August, they should be coming out middle of August. If it's mid-September, they should be coming out mid-September. So I don't think there's any valid reason to sit on them once they're final and they've been approved by the Auditor General. Yes, the printing and the translation, sure. But barring these, the moment they're final, they should be released. At the very latest, I'd expect them in the budget. So we have a November 4th budget date. I expect the final number for 2024-25 to be in the budget. I don't think there's any good reason to postpone the public accounts and present a budget that has still an uncertain number as the deficit for 24-25. So that's why I'm expecting that to be the case. Like
Well,
at the,
To your point in the past about, public accounts coming out after the fall economic statement, it would be quite a good accountability opportunity that if we were in a perfect world getting public accounts a month or so before the next budget came out, that might really help, to make it easier for Canadians to connect the dots between those two documents, perhaps.
Yeah, I think so. And there's no reason for the government to have that information, use it to build its budget, and not disclose it to anybody. Because right now, we all know the government has the final number for 24-25 because the AG has very likely approved it. They know it's their own number, so they have a pretty good sense early on in the cycle what the final number will be for 24-25, and by now they know. So there's no good reason to not disclose that as soon as possible.
Now, another major change that the Carney government is planning to make to the budgeting, this one first announced by Carney back during his leadership campaign, is to split the federal budget into an operating budget and a capital budget. What's your take on this? And are there any upsides? Does this risk adding more confusion to what we've discussed can already be an opaque process?
Well, my opinions are known on that, as I penned a letter in the Financial Post with Alexandre-Laurin of the CD Howe Institute a couple of weeks ago. So I think it's more information, and generally I'm in favor of more information rather than lower or less information. But in that case, we already have a different accounting treatment for investments, spending on capital assets, for example. Like if the government buys a building, warships, fighter jets, it doesn't hit the deficit in just 1 year. Rather, these assets that have a longer lifespan than just a few months, their cost is amortized over their expected lifetime. So, for example, if you buy $20 billion warship or warships that are expected to last 40 years, it affects the deficit to the tune of $500 million per year, so that over time it ends up costing $40 billion. And the rationale is that from a whole of government perspective, the government has taken $20 billion in cash and transformed that into $40 billion worth of warships. So the government still owns that $40 billion, but in a different form. Whereas when it sends a check to grandma of $1,000, the government doesn't get that $1,000; it's gone. So that's why this accounting treatment is different. So we already have that. It's called accrual accounting.
Mhm.
And so for the government to say that they will consider some spending as investments and will presumably amortize its value over a number of years, it suggests that it will or plans to deviate from accounting principles, Canadian accounting principles, international accounting principles, with, I fear, the goal of presenting a lower deficit than what the real number would be. So I think it's more information in the sense that it it could give Canadians a clearer picture as to the type of spending the government is making. But because you call something investment doesn't make it less expensive. It doesn't also change the source of financing. It still has to be financed by taxes or borrowed money or a combination. So you can, like the old analogy, you can put lipstick on a pig and it's still a pig. So I think you can call as many things investment as you want to, but it will still have to be borrowed money or taxation money. So that's why I'm a bit skeptical and even cautious with that change, especially if it's the thin edge of the wedge to get into presenting to Canadians a lower deficit than what the real number is. So that's why I'm very cautious with that approach.
Yes, and to your point on that, do we risk sort of an accountability issue here where perhaps it could be arbitrary since they haven't really clearly defined yet what would go into which category? How should they be held accountable on that? They're not just sort of showing in the operating column what they need to show there's a balance in 3 years.
Well, it's hard to say before seeing the budget. My preference would be to continue with the credible, time tested framework that we have in mind of accrual accounting. We have expertise in that field. The categories are well known. Everybody within the system knows what's a capital asset and what's an operating expenditure. So changing this opens the door to arbitrary decisions. There are ways around that. You can set up clear guidelines and standards around that. But I don't see that much value in that deviation from the established process. But I'm willing to be convinced otherwise, especially if we see something that is solid and credible in the budget. I'm still cautious about that approach because of the risk of presenting a lower deficit than would otherwise be. And with Canadians' traditional aversion to deficits, especially since the 1990s, the temptation for the government or any subsequent government will be to present a lower deficit and try to shove as much expenses in the investment category. It also begs the question, if you have two categories of spending, a broad basket of investment that are deemed good because they don't affect the deficit, and other operating expenditures that affect the deficit, it starts to put two different categories of spending, the good and the bad. So I wouldn't categorize old age security, health transfers, social transfers as bad, but there is a small risk that it will be perceived as such. If we have an operating deficit, the temptation will be to erase that deficit and lower it. And if you only have operating expenses to cut, then there's that risk. But that's like for years and years down the road.
Are there any other improvements you would like to see made to the fiscal cycle at this time to make it more possible for parliamentarians to exercise a greater degree of scrutiny on spending?
Um, there's probably a lot, but if I was to mention one, I think it's a machinery issue. We have the Department of Finance responsible for the budget. We have Treasury Board Secretariat with analysts who know the intricacies of government spending. In some Westminster countries, I think Australia, both institutions are under the same roof. They're merged, in fact. So, but because purists would say finance and treasury board secretariat are indeed under the same roof, but they're two different institutions. So I think it would make budget making easier if the Department of Finance slash Treasury Board Secretariat was one department, even if it means having two ministers. When I was involved in budget making, there was good relationships between two institutions, but budget secrecy often meant that finance officials would not tell Treasury Board Secretariat officials what could be in the budget and could you help us to make sense as to whether Department X really needs 25 million to administer that program. So it was not possible to have these conversations. Things have significantly improved since then. Apparently, there's a much smoother flow of information, but having both institutions under one, like in the same institution, I think would make that work easier. And but that's inside baseball, as we used to say in the Ottawa bubble.
Well, of course, though, these issues do touch all Canadians in terms of how we spend government money. So as a final question, particularly at this moment of high spending that we find ourselves in, why does it matter to the health of our democracy that we strive for empowering parliamentarians to be able to better scrutinize government spending? And what's the impact for Canadians when we do achieve that parliamentarians, MPs, senators are giving the spending the close look that they're meant to?
That's a good question. So right now, budget decisions are made by two persons, one of whom has power over whether the other one keeps his job or loses his job. So it's the prime minister and the minister of finance making budget decisions. And when there's a disagreement between these two, you can guess who wins the day. And in theory, cabinet makes these decisions or has to approve, but in practice, it's these two. They table the budget the day of the budget at cabinet, and they say, "You all approve, right?" And if they don't get hit by the door on your way out. So it's essentially two persons, and that's the way the system works. And there's very good reasons for that, and it's been relatively efficient so far. But I think because of that concentration of power, you have to give parliamentarians, all 400 of them, some power to scrutinize these decisions taken by two persons. Otherwise, there's a risk that mistakes will be made and nobody will be able to catch them. And it will still happen no matter how many hundreds of people are allowed to review these spending decisions. But I think to leave everything in the hands of two persons without checks and balances is counter to the democratic process and the reason why we elect our MPs and why we appoint, through the Prime Minister, senators in the so called Chamber of Sober Second Thoughts. There's a lot of wealth, of experience, rather, of wisdom and acquired experience in these two chambers. And I think we should take advantage of that and allow them, at least, to have a say in the spending decisions and be able to scrutinize and make honest suggestions beyond partisanship. Otherwise, we deprive ourselves of the experience, skills, and wisdom of almost 400 people. It speeds up things, but I think that's in good part why we elect them, to make decisions in our best interest, collective best interest, and also decisions that represent what we want out of this country.
Right on. Well, we will certainly be watching closely when it comes down next week, as I know you will be as well. I hope you enjoy watching your first budget post PBO, getting to take it in from a different perspective there. And Yves, we really appreciate you joining us on the podcast today.
Many thanks for the invitation.
And if you are still watching, please remember to like and subscribe. It helps us reach more folks. And thanks for watching Inside Policy Talks.